Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's 5 by 15 event. We have 5 fantastic speakers here with us this evening who are here to share stories and insights about their lives and their work. As ever, you can order copies of their new books from New and Bookshop, our independent book selling partner. So do keep an eye out for the info in the chat about how to do that. To begin, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker tonight, Johann, author of 3 internationally best-selling books, which have been translated into 40 languages. His TED Talks have been viewed over 80 million times, and his work has drawn praise from such figures as Oprah Winfrey and Elton John. It's great to have Johann back at 5 by 15 tonight to tell us about his new book, Magic Pill, which looks at the drugs transforming weight loss as we know it. Johann, welcome.
Hey, Jack. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I have to apologize in advance if there's a slightly weird sound while I'm talking. I'm in Hollywood, which sounds very glamorous, but there's a massive building site right next to where I am, so slightly less glam than it sounds. So if you're hearing a weird sound, I apologize. There's nothing I can do about that. I'm also very excited that Dorian Lynskey is one of the other speakers because I just read his most recent book and it's fantastic. So you should all read it. Yeah. So. A lot of people won't know yet, but we now have a new kind of weight loss drug that works in a completely new way that produces an extraordinary amount of weight loss. The average person taking Ozempic now loses 15% of their body weight. For Mounjaro, which is the next in this class of drugs, the average person loses 21% of their body weight. And for the next in line in these drugs, Triple G, that will probably be available next year, the average person loses 24% of their body weight, which is staggering. And I'll never forget the moment I learned about these drugs and how conflicted I felt about them right from the start. It was the winter of 2022. And you remember that moment when the world was just kind of reopening again after everything we'd all been through. And I was in an Uber on a way to a party. It was the first party I'd been to since the lockdowns began, however long before, more than 18 months before. The party was being thrown by an Oscar-winning actor. I'm not saying that just to name drop. It's relevant to what happened next. And in the Uber, I was feeling a bit self-conscious because, like a lot of people, I'd gained quite a lot of weight during lockdown and I'd been quite fat at the start. And I was thinking, I was feeling a bit schlubby. And then I thought, oh, wait, this is actually going to be a really interesting party because almost everyone I know gained weight during lockdown. It's going to be fascinating to see these Hollywood stars with a bit of chub on them, right? So I arrived and I started walking around and it was the weirdest thing. It's not just that they hadn't gained weight. The people at the party had visibly lost lots of weight. They were gaunt. They looked like their own Snapchat filters, cleaner and clearer and sharper than before. And it wasn't just the kind of stars, like the agents and their partners and everyone looked much thinner. And I bumped into a friend of mine on the dance floor and I said to her, wow, looks like everyone really did take up Pilates during lockdown. And she laughed and I didn't know why. And she pulled up on her phone an image of an Ozempic pen. And as soon as I knew about these weight loss drugs and the scientific evidence that they produce a huge amount of weight loss, I immediately felt such a mixture of emotions. I thought, well, I'm older now than my grandfather ever got to be because he died when he was 44 of a heart attack. Loads of the men in my family get heart disease. My dad had terrible heart problems. My uncle died of a heart attack. I knew that obesity makes heart disease much more likely. In fact, makes over 200 known medical conditions or complications more likely, or indeed causes them. So I thought, wow, if there really is a drug that can reverse obesity, that's going to have a huge effect, right? Potentially a positive effect. But I also thought, wait a minute. I've seen this story before, right? About once every 20 years, a new miracle weight loss drug is announced. We're always told it's going to save the world. Millions of people take it, and then we always discover it has some horrendous side effect and has to be pulled from the market, leaving a trail of devastated people in its wake, right? I also was very worried about what this would mean for the progress we've made for body positivity. I worried about what it would mean for people with eating disorders. I just had so many concerns so quickly. So to research this for a year, I took the drug and I went on a big journey all over the world, from Iceland to Minneapolis to Okinawa in the south of Japan, to interview a huge array of the experts on this and people whose lives have been changed by Ozempic, by obesity, by this wider debate. I spoke to the biggest defenders of the drug, the biggest critics of the drugs, and people in between. And I learned a huge amount. But I think the reality is, and this is unusual for me, this wasn't the case in my previous books, I'm still pretty conflicted about this topic. I think anyone who's telling you, yay, everyone should take them, or boo, no one should take them, I think is missing the more complicated and interesting and ambiguous situation in the middle, where we're all going to have to weigh the benefits and risks for ourselves, all of us who are obese and overweight, which is a majority of British people and a big majority of Americans. And do not underestimate how much this is going to affect the lives of all of us. Emily Field was commissioned, she's a sober-minded financial analyst who was commissioned by Barclays Bank to look into the effects of these drugs and what they would mean for the bank's investment decisions going forward. She came back and said, if you want a comparison for what these drugs will do, you've got to compare it to the invention of the smartphone. And I think she's right. 47% of Americans want to use these drugs. One leading cardiovascular expert predicted to me, in relatively soon, 30% of British people will be taking them, because pretty soon there's going to be a daily pill. And the benefits are really clear and they are quite significant. And if you want to understand them, I think it actually helps to look at a parallel area of science. People have only been taking these drugs for weight loss for a couple of years, but there's another area of science that I think tells us a lot about what they'll do to us. So up to now, it's been extremely hard to lose huge amounts of weight and keep it off without an external intervention. A minority of people can do it just through calorie restriction. And if you can, good luck to you. But sadly, they're a small minority of people. So up to now, the most effective way of producing a lot of weight loss has actually been bariatric surgery, things like stomach stapling. And we know that is a grim and grueling operation. 1 in 1,000 people dies in the operation. It's no joke. But the reason people go through it is because when you reverse or massively reduce obesity, the effects on health are extraordinary. If you have bariatric surgery in the 7 years that follow, you are 56% less likely to die of a heart attack. You are 60% less likely to die of cancer. You are 92% less likely to die of diabetes-related causes. In fact, it's so good for your health that in those 7 years, you're 40% less likely to die at all, right? And we know with these drugs, the evidence is becoming clear there are similar benefits. If you take them and you start with a BMI higher than 27, you are 20% less likely to have a heart attack or stroke, right? So obvious big health benefits to reducing or reversing obesity. Against that, you've got to weigh the potential risks of these drugs. And I go through 12 quite significant potential risks to these drugs that I am concerned about. And they range quite widely. There are some scientists who are worried they might increase your risk of thyroid cancer. There are other scientists who are worried that when we give these drugs to rats, or the active component to these rats, they're much more likely, if they're pregnant, to have babies with birth deformities. There's an array of worrying factors. I'm going to come back to one of the factors that I felt play out one of the risk factors that I felt play out in my own life. But the truth is, if you only look at the risk of the drugs, I think we should definitely look at those risks of the drugs. I'm worried about lots of them. It's possible that over time they will outweigh the benefits. But I think we've got to level with people and say that for someone like me, you've got to weigh two risks. There's the risks of the drugs versus the risks of continuing to be obese. Realistically, I would have continued to be obese, right? I've been obese almost all my adult life, with a few little intervals of not. And so, Dr. Shauna Levy, who's an obesity expert at Tulane School of Medicine in New Orleans, said to me, we don't know the long-term risks of these drugs, but we do know the long-term risks of obesity, and they are really significant. I also think it's worth talking a bit about how it actually feels to take them. And I think it's really relevant if I explain how it feels, it opens up onto a much more important, wider debate, I think. I'll never forget the second day I took Ozempic, the second day after I took the first dose, I woke up, I was lying in bed, and I thought, oh, I feel something really weird. What is it? And I couldn't locate in my body what it was. And it took a couple of minutes to realize I had woken up and I wasn't hungry. That had never happened to me before. And I went there's a cafe just up the road from where I live when I'm in London. And I went in and I ordered what I used to order every day, which is a huge chicken bap with loads of chicken and mayo in it. And I had 3 or 4 mouthfuls and I was just full. I couldn't eat anymore. Normally I would eat the whole thing and still be hungry and want some crisps. And that's how I felt from then on. I felt an extraordinary feeling of fullness very quickly. It was like kind of shutters had come down on my appetite. And for a long time, when I was working on Magic Pill, I thought I was looking at 2 separate topics. I thought I was looking at the question of how these drugs work and the question of why obesity exploded so much in my lifetime. Just stop for a moment and, I mean, this after I've finished speaking and everyone else has been speaking, but Google pictures of beaches in Britain in, say, 1979, the year I was born. They look really weird to us. Everyone in them looks like they're kind of skinny, right? You think this is weird. Where was everyone else that day? If you look to in the year I was born, 6% of British people were obese. It's now 27% and rising. A staggering explosion. Why did this happen? And for a long time, I thought these were separate questions. Why did we become obese? Why did how do these drugs work, right? But in fact, the same word explains both. And that word is satiety. It's not a word we use that often in everyday English, but satiety is the feeling of being full and not wanting more. And it turns out the food we're eating is massively undermining our ability to ever feel sated, to ever feel full. And this is, obesity blows up in every country that makes one change. It's where people move from mostly eating a diet based on fresh whole foods they prepared on the day to mostly eating a diet made of processed and ultra-processed foods, which means they're assembled, they're built out of chemicals in factories. And it turns out this new kind of food affects us in a really different way, which led us into the path of these drugs. And there's an experiment that to me really just distills this. I've nicknamed it Cheesecake Park. It's not the official title. It's carried out by a brilliant scientist I interviewed named Professor Paul Kenny, who's at head of neuroscience at Mount Sinai in New York. So it's a very simple experiment. He got a load of rats and he raised them in a cage and he gave them nothing to eat, but the kind of natural whole foods that rats evolved to eat over thousands of years. And when that's all they had, the rats would eat when they were hungry and then they would just stop. They had some kind of natural nutritional wisdom that meant they'd go, guys, you've had enough, stop now. Then Professor Kenny introduced them to the American diet. He got a load of cheesecake, he fried up some bacon, he bought some Snickers bars, and he put that alongside the healthy food. And the rats went crazy for the American diet. They would literally dive into the cheesecake and eat their way out. All this nutritional wisdom they used to have disappeared. They ate and ate and ate and ate. And quite rapidly, they were all severely overweight. Then Professor Kenny tweaked the experiment in a way that to me as a former KFC addict feels a bit cruel. He took away all the American food and left them with nothing but the healthy food again. And he was sure he knew what would happen. They would eat more of the healthy food than they had at the start, and that would prove that this kind of junk food expands the number of calories you eat. That is not what happened. Something much weirder happened. Once they'd had the American diet and it was taken away, they refused to eat the healthy food at all. It was like they no longer recognized it as food. It was only when they were starving that they went back to eating it. Now, there's a huge amount of evidence this is happening in humans. I go through it in the book. The kind of food we're eating is destroying our satiety. It's stealing our satiety. It's preventing us from ever feeling full. And what these drugs do is they give you back your feeling of satiety. And the mechanism by which they work is pretty clear. If you ate something now, your pancreas will produce a hormone called GLP-1. A GLP-1 is just part of the natural brakes on eating. It's basically the signal from your body going, hey, you've had enough, stop now. But that natural signal only stays in your system for a few minutes and then it's washed away. What these drugs do is they inject you with an artificial copy of GLP-1 that doesn't just stay in your system for a few minutes, it stays in your system for a whole week. And that's why when I went to eat the chicken roll in the cafe, I suddenly feel so full, right? So we know, the way Professor Michael Lowe put it to me, is these drugs are an artificial solution to an artificial problem. Processed and ultra-processed food dug this hole of hunger in all of us, and the drugs fill it, but at a cost. And there are many costs. And I'll tell you about one of the drawbacks that I experienced just quickly. I'll never forget the epiphany I had about this. I was in Las Vegas and I was writing about something difficult. I've been researching for another book, and quite painful. I was investigating the murder of someone that I knew and loved. So it's upsetting. And I went to this branch of KFC that I've been to 1,000 times. And I ordered what I would have ordered before Ozempic to make myself feel better. I ordered a bucket of fried chicken. And I was I ate one of the drumsticks and I just couldn't eat anymore, right? You can't overeat when you're on Ozempic, you would be sick. And I kind of realized in that moment, oh, A, how much I use food to manage my emotions, but B, what these drugs do is they radically interrupt your eating patterns. And what that does is bring to the surface for many people some of the underlying psychological drivers why they eat. I suspect that's why a significant number of people, although it's a minority, seem to be reporting becoming depressed on these drugs. It wasn't that bad for me, but I can see where it's coming from. There is a debate about that. Some scientists dispute it. But there's all sorts of things that are unexpected about these drugs. And my book is called Magic Pill because there are three ways these drugs could be magic, right? The first is the most obvious. They could just solve the problem, right? And there are days when it feels like that. My whole life I've overeaten, and now I inject myself once a week in the leg and I don't overeat anymore. It feels like magic. The second way is much more disturbing. It could be like a magic trick. It could be like the magician who shows you a card trick while picking your pocket. It could be that the 12 significant risks of these drugs outweigh the benefits over time. I do not rule that out. The third way I actually think is the most obvious. Think about all the stories about magic that we grew up with when we were kids, right? Think about Aladdin. You find the lamp, you rub it, the genie appears, you get your wish, and your wish comes true, but never quite in the way that you expected, right? I think we're already seeing all sorts of very unpredictable effects of these drugs, some very positive. The US airlines just had a report saying they're going to have to spend a lot less on jet fuel soon because the population's getting so much thinner. Some really disturbing drawbacks. Think about eating disorders. I'm very worried about what's happening with eating disorders and young girls getting a hold of these drugs, which has already begun. But I think we need to know the stakes here are really high, right? Whether we get this right will determine whether lots of people live or die. Obesity is by many measures the biggest killer in our society. I believe this is a risky, rusty trapdoor that we're being offered. It's the only trapdoor anyone offered me. We've got to deal with the deeper underlying causes. But the stakes here are really high. These drugs are blowing up. We need to stop and think about the benefits and the risks very carefully before we leap into this. I hope my book gives people a chance to do that. Thanks so much for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Johann. That was fascinating and such a thought-provoking way to kick off this evening. Thank you.
Cheers.
Our second speaker this evening is the writer and journalist Clover Stroud, who writes regularly for the Sunday Times, The Guardian, and the Saturday and Sunday Telegraph. Her first book, The Wild Other, was shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize, and her acclaimed second and third books, My Wild and Sleepless Nights and Red of My Blood, were instant bestsellers and voted as best books of the year. She joins us this evening from the US to speak about her new book, The Giant on the Skyline, a memoir about family, belonging, and home. Clover, welcome.
Thank you.
We can't see you at the moment, Clover. Oh,
Sorry,
there we go.
Oh,
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to go home. In those 5 words, I can hear so much of the emotion and the longing of my life. Home, I want to go back there. I think that all of us at some point have longed for home. But what does it really mean? Is it a place that you can return to, an actual location? Or is it the memory of a place bathed in the rosy pink glow of perspective and nostalgia? Is it a physical place, like a landscape or a city, a street or a wood, an ocean or a beach that you feel especially connected to? And is home something less tangible, something ineffable? Is it a memory, a feeling, or even the memory of a feeling? Or imagination? Is home the act of imagination itself? Home as a place, a memory, a subject, a location is something that has obsessed me and haunted me too since I can first remember feeling. That longing for home is something that I've thought of since I was very small, and homesickness is one of my earliest memories. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I was staying at the house of a friend as my mother had unusually gone away for a single night. I was upstairs, and I can remember from downstairs the smell of something being cooked, like onions. The mother of the house was making something kind of cozy and reassuring, like cottage pie or spaghetti bolognese. I had nothing to be afraid of. I was being cared for beautifully. My mum was going to come back very soon. And yet my child's heart can remember that feeling of longing, the feeling of melancholy, of a kind of physical pain at being separated from home with my mother in it. And I can remember that feeling even now, and it still hurts a lot. So much of my child and my adult life has been spent trying to locate and find a home to feel myself in. And I read a quote recently which said, "Home is a place where we can stop running." That sort of made me think a lot, because I also want to make it clear that my search for home comes from a place of great privilege. And this feels important, especially right now, at this moment in time, when so many people are facing the devastation or very, very real loss of home due to conflict or climate change or global unrest everywhere. I wasn't facing persecution. I wasn't facing war. I wasn't a refugee. I hadn't been made homeless. And yet, I think that this preoccupation with home and what it represents is something that a lot of us share. And I was curious too about a sensation that I felt since I was really very small, about a kind of homesickness that occurred even when I was standing in my kitchen at home. This sort of feeling of longing for something intangible, for that ineffable thing that I couldn't quite define, is probably best described by Basho. Of course, it would be Basho, wouldn't it? Whose haiku I've included in the prologue to my new book, The Giant on the Skyline, which is all about home. And Basho wrote, "Even in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo's call, I long for Kyoto." Home as a place and a location became even more urgent for me a couple of years ago, when my husband, who traveled a lot for his work, suggested that we should leave our slightly shabby, messy, colourful cottage in Oxfordshire and move with our 5 children to Washington, DC, where his work was taking him a lot. Well, I can assure you that that sent me into a complete and utter frenzy and headspin. I was actually being made to leave home. And it forced me to turn my attention outwards, to search and to try and define the feeling of home. What was it that I was really scared of losing when Pete said, let's leave England, let's move to America? And I thought that if I could define home, then perhaps leaving it wouldn't make me feel quite so sad. It wouldn't make me feel quite so bad. And this kind of exploration of home and what it is took me to many different places: literal, spiritual, emotional. They start, I suppose, in Oxford. I was born in Oxford, but I grew up in the countryside, and that is where I feel most at home, in a fairly remote corner of Wiltshire. And apart from a couple of stints abroad and some years in Oxford, which isn't really like a big city, it's more like a kind of provincial market town, really, apart from the university, I've never lived in a city. I've lived in the country my entire life. I feel intensely at home in a wet, dense, green, muddy field. I really know where I am in a village shop. And I love local life, and I feel really passionate about defending the countryside from kind of accusations that it's boring or it's twee or it's a place for kind of self-satisfied retirement or millionaires' mansions. I find this sort of fetishization of cottagecore on social media both ridiculous and deeply patronizing. Rural life is filled with just as much human pain and human torment and human longing and love and excitement and energy as any kind of cityscape is. And anybody who thinks that the countryside is sleepy or quiet has never brought up teenagers in a village or been to a rave or had the dubious pleasure of trying to look after animals in the countryside through a very, very wet winter. So in my writing, in my definition of home, I have tried to capture what rural life means to me. And a big part of that is the people, is the rural voices. I went out and I talked to many different people who made up the rural life that I know. They include my the blacksmith who used to come and put the shoes on my horses, who would come over. He came from Swindon, and he would tell me about buying a house with his boyfriend, and how excited he was and what Swindon meant to him as a home. And I talked to the fencer who came to fix the fences and who was also a Morris dancer and an ultra marathon runner and a raver. I talked to the unemployed girl who was living in a van and off on her way down to perhaps live in Bristol, perhaps live in Southampton, perhaps go and live on Dartmoor. These real people all showed me versions of home that I found incredibly valuable. I also turned to the actual landscape, the physical landscape itself, while I was searching for this definition of home. And I'm lucky to have lived in South Oxfordshire on a corner which borders Wiltshire and Berkshire. And the Ridgeway, the ancient track which crosses the hills there, which is known as Europe's oldest road, is where I fixed my attention, a place that I could see from my house at home. What I love about this landscape is that it's an intensely human landscape. It doesn't feel like a distant wilderness at all. And it's been used for millennia by people as a trading route, by Roman soldiers, and more recently by walkers, by ravers, by families who use it as a place of escape, I suppose. That sense of the human within the landscape was really, really important to me. And I went up there to try and, I suppose, to try and touch the past, to try and understand the past and hear some of these voices. And anybody who's walked on that part of Oxfordshire will know that it isn't hard to hear those voices from the past. They're very, very clearly there, as much as the walkers that you see in their Dago colours. You can feel the ancient rhythms of the past. And this is a ritual landscape. I love those two words together. I think it's so beautiful. And you sense the work of man all over the landscape, who has kind of sculpted the green hills, I suppose, with the Iron Age hill forts and the standing stones and the long barrows, and of course the extraordinary white chalk horse at at Uffington, which is so strange and so unknowable. And I spent a long time in searching for home, my definition of home here now, of trying to understand people in the past. Why did they go to the effort to drag those massive stones about? Why did they go to the effort to cut the turf off the hill and make this horse? And that gave me a stronger sense of home being not so much a place of rocks, of landscape, but a place of something very, very human. I also delved into the sort of local history of the area. One afternoon, I went with my teenage son, who was just about to leave for university, to go and look for the remnants of a lost village called Snap up on the Ridgeway, looking for clues about what it might offer to me, about whether a place holds a memory of home long after the people have left it. I looked at my local town called Wantage, which you could see it as a sort of provincial little market town. I kind of scratched the surface, looked under the surface, and found a history which was kind of wilder and stranger than anything that I was expecting. A place of horse trading and a big itinerant population. And probably my favorite thing that I found out when I was researching the book, which was that the Bow Street Runners, who are the forerunners to the Metropolitan Police, when they were looking for a criminal on the run from London, the place that they always went to was Wantage. I don't know why exactly, but this pleased me a great deal. I also looked for home in my relationships with emotion and memory, and mainly that was in my relationship with the dead. I thought that home might be embodied by people as much as by landscape, and I tried to understand the way in which my relationship with my mum and my sister, who have both died and with whom I spent a long time on the Ridgeway, might be kind of lost if I left that corner of Oxfordshire. And I think honestly that something is lost. I live in America now, and I am very aware that in moving away from England, I have lost a kind of tangible connection to them. And but it does focus my mind on the fact that grief is a huge part of our lives, but that also that it is with the living that we must live, that focusing on the living is so important. And finally, this kind of exploration of home made me concentrate a lot on what I was trying to create for my children. This obsession with home. What was it really about? I'd had a very happy childhood, but I didn't want to kind of slavishly recreate everything that I had done in the same way as a kid for my own children. And instead, there was the creative act of home, of creating new textures, new colors, new rituals with my children. And I think the thing that I found most interesting about thinking about the children and what they wanted from home and what I was trying to give them was the sense that home for them was not in any way a perfect interior. It was not the kind of, beautiful interiors that you see on Instagram or in an interiors magazine. And it wasn't a picturesque view. Home for them was about their relationship with other people too. It was about the kind of simplicity of going to the scruffy little village shop and buying comics and ice lollies and having them, out on the grass with other kids from the village. It was in their relationships with other children who they'd sat at desks in the state schools that they'd been to locally. It was in the bonds that they'd formed in their local karate club, in their ballet class. Very, very occasionally, their sense of home was in how I'd sort of dragged them round these ancient stones. But more than anything, home was about people. It was much, much more than landscape. So I hope you'll read the book, and I'm not spoiling anything when I say to you that I did leave this place that I love so much, and I have come to Washington, D.C., where I am now. And I am, I suppose, creating a new community, new friendships. I have a friendship with the man who lives near Baltimore, who I take my daughter for a riding lesson with, and the karate teacher from Iran, who is a great friend here, and the people who work in the bookshop where I go and sit at the cafe to work every day. What I've found about home more than anything is that it is in these friendships and in these human connections. And when we say, I want to go home, that statement that I start with, what we're actually talking about, I think, is about human comfort and human connection. So what I would leave you with, I hope, was that sense that home is in community. It is in friendships, and working on that community and creating those friendships and making time for one another is the place where real comfort and real home is found. Thank you very much.
Clover, thank you so much. That was such a moving meditation on home, and it's given us lots to think about. Thank you. Our fourth speaker tonight is Dorian Lynskey, who writes about music, film, books, and politics for publications including The Guardian, The Observer, The New Statesman, Billboard, and Empire. He's the author of several highly acclaimed books, including 33 Revolutions Per Minute, A History of Protest Songs, and The Ministry of Truth, a biography of George Orwell's 1984, which was longlisted for both the Baillie Gifford and the Orwell Prize. His new book, Everything Must Go, is an original and revealing exploration of our collective fixation on the end of the world. Dorian, welcome.
Thanks, Jack. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you. So yeah, the subtitle, which Jack didn't mention, which is fine, is The Stories We Tell About the End of the World. And the reason I chose that is because I wanted to reflect the fact that I'm talking about fiction, I'm talking about novels and films and TV shows and video games and comic books and so on, and all the different ways that we imagine the world will end. But then there's also the stories that we tell, that politicians tell, activists, scientists, even the ones that we tell ourselves. And a lot of the time, the reason why activists are telling them is because they want to get across a message and they want to galvanize people. And so I just wanted to talk about a couple of different sort of sections of the book where it's really two halves of the same story, which is how useful is fear? Because people sometimes ask, well, why? What is the point of these stories of the end? And obviously entertainment is one of them. But I wondered, whether are they actually useful? That if you make people think about the worst thing that can possibly happen, does that encourage them to avoid it? The idea is yes, but is it necessarily true? So I'm going to start with Oppenheimer. Christopher Nolan very kindly decided to make a film about one of the main characters in my book. So many people will know this already, that the members of the Manhattan Project were generally less shocked by what their invention had done in Hiroshima and Nagasaki than by what it might do in the future to America, to the rest of the world. They were imagining what happens when everybody has nuclear weapons. And Edward R. Murrow, the famous CBS anchorman, said, "Seldom, if ever, has a war ended, leaving the victors with such a sense of uncertainty and fear, with such a realization that the future is obscure and that survival is not assured." So some of the scientists set up the Federation of Atomic Scientists magazine, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which is where we get the image of the doomsday clock, which is updated every year to see how things are going. Anyway, at the same time, some of these scientists were trying to get international agreement. There was a plan that Oppenheimer co-authored that was taken to the UN, and the idea was that you could somehow get the US and the USSR to agree to control nuclear weapons, to basically avoid the arms race. And one of the mechanisms that the scientists used was fear. And one of the physicists was called Harold Urey, and he wrote in a magazine that without arms control, we will eat fear, sleep fear, live in fear, and die in fear. And he was saying, I'm frightened. Everyone I know is frightened. You should all be frightened. So there was a real sense that like time was running out, and that if we did not get this arms agreement, then we were all doomed. Anyway, we didn't. It was the beginning of the Cold War. There was mutual distrust. The agreement fell apart. And then, of course, what happens when the deadline has passed? Does that mean we're all doomed? And one of the people involved in this plan, David Lilienthal, who was chair of the Atomic Energy Commission, said, "It might have seemed like a good idea to scare the world into being good, but fear is brother to panic. Fear is an unreliable ally. It can never be depended upon to produce good." Nonetheless, many writers, many filmmakers were absolutely terrified throughout the 50s. The invention of the hydrogen bomb, Korean War, all kinds of reasons to think that actually they weren't going to make it to the end of the decade. So you get these remarkable works like the movie On the Beach, and the novel it was based on, Stanley Kubrick's movie Dr. Strangelove, Roald Dahl's first novel, Sometime Never, which not many people have read because he arranged for it never to be reprinted. So it's an absolutely terrifying vision of the entire world wiped out by nuclear war and taken over by gremlins. So it's a strange book and less popular than his later work. So the real test of like what happens, what happens to the human brain when you think it's actually going to be the end, was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, a standoff over Soviet missiles that was stationed in Cuba. And for 13 days, Kennedy, the John F. Kennedy administration, and Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow were going back and forth, communicating, trying to avert an actual nuclear war. And Khrushchev said, "I'm glad I was frightened, as I was absolutely terrified, and that helped avert war, and that maybe we should all be frightened." But as soon as it was over, public concern about nuclear war and opinion polls just plummeted. So the fact that it almost happened was eclipsed by the fact that it hadn't happened. And basically people wanted to forget about it and thought, well, if this is as bad as it gets, and we step back from the brink, then sort of let's not think about this again. A psychiatrist called Robert J. Lifton dedicated himself to studying the psychology of the bomb over the next few decades. He's still alive now, he's 97. And he wrote a great book where he went to Hiroshima and interviewed survivors there about the experience of an atomic bomb. And then in a later book called Indefensible Weapons, he wrote about the psychology of living with the bomb. And he said the problem was that the fear was so vast and constant that it produced either resignation, cynicism, or yearning. And the problem was that if you're very, very scared, you want to do something about it. You want to act. But in that case, trying to sort of abolish nuclear weapons, there was a feeling that action would be both difficult and possibly fruitless. Like, what can I do to change geopolitics? And so what the brain sort of does is resolves that by going either it's not going to happen or it is going to happen and there's nothing you can do about it, or weirdest of all, sort of bring it on. Like, let's not hang around waiting. That's the hard bit. So that's what he meant by yearning. And somebody else around the same time called Roger Molander, who worked on disarmament for President Jimmy Carter, he put it slightly differently, making a similar point. And he identified like 3 reasons for apathy, 3 groups of people. He said there are those who think it might happen, but is no big deal, that we could survive it without a great deal of damage. Those who think nuclear war is unthinkable, so devastating that it would never be permitted to happen. And those who think it's a real possibility, but there's nothing they can do about it. And these are all very distinct ways of thinking about nuclear weapons, but they all lead you to basically not doing anything, either because you feel you don't have to, or you feel that it won't make any difference. Now, this was sort of the early 1980s, we're talking here. And there was another period, possibly actually more dangerous, more terrifying than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Around 1983, you had President Ronald Reagan in Washington. You had an assortment of difficult men in Moscow. There were various misunderstandings that are absolutely blood-curdling to learn about, where there might have been a nuclear war by mistake. What happened then, though, was that for various reasons, the Soviet Union decided to pull back. You had Mikhail Gorbachev, who realized it was too expensive. It could no longer really survive as a nuclear state, as a kind of, an equal and opposite force in the Cold War. Long story short, the Cold War ends. In 1991, which is when the Soviet Union disintegrates, the doomsday clock is at 17 minutes to midnight, which now just appears almost inconceivable, just an absolute magical time. But at the same time, we were seeing the rise of climate change as an issue, leading up to the Rio summit in 1992. So almost like the fear moved. It was like, we don't have to worry about nuclear weapons, but here's this other thing that is terrifying. Now, Robert J. Lifton, because he was so long-lived, at the age of 90 in 2017, published a book called The Climate Swerve, in which he called the bomb and the climate crisis apocalyptic twins. And he said there was a danger that they both produced what he called psychic numbing. Now, there's lots of differences between nuclear weapons and the climate crisis. There's the time scale, which is why you don't get many movies about climate change, because everything happens too slowly, except in The Day After Tomorrow, where they just threw science out the window and said, let's have it happen in a fortnight, which is good for movies, but not good science. And then there's also the question of culpability, that you cannot blame the warmongers, you cannot blame these, sort of mad generals or politicians. There's a sort of general culpability which produces very strange emotions of sort of guilt and shame. And the solutions are less clear as well. Nonetheless, I think that is the thing that most people are scared about now. And some activists want to use that fear in the same way that the scientists were trying to do in the late 1940s. So you may know this famous speech by Greta Thunberg to world leaders in 2019. And she said, I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. So her assumption there is that fear makes people act, which of course it does on a personal level, whether you're crossing the road or trying to avoid being, killed by a bear. Fear encourages you to take prophylactic action to avoid the danger. But on a larger scale, that's not really how it plays out psychologically. So if we go back to Roger Molander's 3 kinds of apathy, similar thing is happening here. There's the people who think climate change won't be that bad, which is the outright climate deniers, but also the people that think, well, we've had all these deadlines and tipping points, and we're still here and things don't seem so bad. And so they don't really believe the warnings anymore. Then there are the people that do believe the warnings and think, well, my God, this is going to be so bad that obviously governments and just, people in general are going to do something about it. And then you've got the people who think that it's so bad that nothing can be done about it, which produces a kind of weird sort of smug cynicism, sometimes verging on nihilism, the idea that realism and moral clarity is accepting that we're doomed. So this word, doomerism. is really apt here, a kind of wallowing in the idea that things can only get worse. Now, needless to say, that is not any more helpful than outright climate change denial. It's still a way to not do things. Now, there are some people who are really galvanized by the fear. I've met some activists from Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, and it's almost the nightmare scenario is what makes them kind of put their bodies on the line and risk prison and protest. But this isn't most people. Most people have that kind of the resignation, the cynicism, the yearning. A lot of climate change writing in fiction, we have this sort of mixture of shame, fear, and despair. And I think that the lesson that people can learn now from the Cold War is that fear is double-edged, is that you can use it to shock people into paying attention. But once they're paying attention, you need to give them the hope of a solution, which is why activists like to use phrases like radical hope, which is not the same as optimism, because optimism is thinking things will work out whatever I do. Whereas radical hope is like things could be, yeah, we can avoid disaster, but we actually need to do something. And if you're interested in fiction like that, there's a writer, Kim Stanley Robinson, books like Ministry for the Future, where it's sort of between denial and despair. It's going, here is a problem, but here are things that can be done about it. It's the sort of, he's a disaster novelist who really believes in conferences and meetings and plans, which is very unusual. And I think that what this mindset is summed up by a climate scientist called Gavin Schmidt. And he says, it sounds cute to say, oh, we're fucked and there's nothing we can do, but it's a bit of a nihilistic attitude. We always have the choice. We can continue to make worse decisions, or we can try to make ever better decisions. And this plays into what Robert J. Lifton calls the anxiety of responsibility, which is essentially making fear useful. Because this is where we are now. We do have a massive problem, as we had a massive problem with nuclear weapons, particularly in the 50s and the early 80s. And it's perfectly normal and understandable to be very scared, but you have to be more than scared. You have to harness fear rather than being paralyzed by it, drowning in it, and in some weird way relishing it, because saying things cannot be fixed ensures that they cannot be fixed. It is a sort of complicity in catastrophe. So the challenge, and what I hope is one of the themes that comes out of the book, is how to process this very legitimate fear and sometimes use it to prod people awake without surrendering to that deadly trio: resignation, cynicism, and yearning. And then we have the potential to actually do something useful and change the world for the better. So this is one of the ideas that comes out of the book. There's a lot of different things in there, but I think I did keep coming back to the idea of how can contemplating the worst help us avoid the worst. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Dorian, thank you so much. We so enjoyed listening to you. That was such a bracing insight into this topic, which concerns all of us, and great to have a kind of new insight into what hope might look like. Thank you so much. Our final speaker this evening is children's author and illustrator Lauren Child, who's best known for her series of Charlie and Lola picture books, which were adapted into a BAFTA-winning children's TV show, and the Clarice Bean series, which has sold more than 7 million copies and won legions of fans around the world. Lauren has won numerous awards for her work and was appointed a CBE in 2021 for her services to children's literature. Tonight, she's here to talk about the importance of childhood, and we're so pleased to have her with us. Lauren, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's lovely to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about childhood, because from a very tiny age, my older sister felt that my mother and father were getting things wrong, and she didn't hold back from challenging their parental competency. She would regularly pointed out to them that they were incompetent. And on one occasion, she noticed that the tax disc had unglued itself from the windscreen of our car, and she became convinced that my mother's failure to display it would lead to our parents' imprisonment. And my mother said, you know, don't worry about it. But my sister said, but when they take you away, what will happen to us? And I could tell she properly understood exactly how these things played out. My mother had to pull over and stick the tax disc to the windscreen with the only thing she had to hand, which was Green Shield stamps. And as anyone who grew up in the 70s with no Green Shield stamps, reward tokens for shopping, were valuable things, and you collect enough and you could perhaps buy a set of coffee glasses. Nothing my family would ever find a need for, but they were very desirable to own. My mother and father's parental shortcomings were not so much my concern, because my sister had that covered. I had wider worries. One of the big ones, obviously, was rabies. I'd never stepped foot in Europe, but I did know that it was absolutely teeming with rabid dogs. And I knew this because, you know, foreign dogs were not allowed into the country without quarantine. So when I heard there was to be a channel tunnel, I was naturally very alarmed. What madness! You know, these dogs would be rushing through the tunnel and foaming at the mouth, and they would be biting everyone, and then there would be mass death. Unlike my sister, who is a child of action, I kept this worry very close and told no one until it finally came out one Christmas during a game of charades. My uncle and father were acting out mad dogs and Englishmen and pretending to bite people's knees. And I found this to be in very poor taste, given what a serious affliction rabies is. So I left the room, and my aunt came to find me, and she managed to eke this worry out of me. And she explained, you know, why this was not going to be so, and this was not going to happen. And I believed her because she said it with some authority, and the worry disappeared. It was almost instantly replaced by the larger anxiety of nuclear war, which was not so easy to dispel. No one could explain to me how taking a door off its hinges and leaning it against the wall in your hall would protect me from nuclear fallout. To these questions, they just said, you know what, don't worry about it. But children have a pretty acute early warning system and fairly adept at reading the room. They gauge when someone is not really telling the truth. And it became clear that don't worry about it tended to mean we have absolutely no idea. Something my sister had already figured out much younger than I. I very often write about children actually from a child's point of view, so with their voice. And it's because the way they look at the world is very interesting. It's not linear. It's often reassuring in the way they cut through to the important things. There's no willful small talk. I didn't intend to write for children, though. And sometimes, if I'm honest, I wish I'd stepped into a more glamorous world. A career working in the field of children's books is rarely what I would ever call glamorous. It's not unusual to find yourself in a room that smells distinctly of mashed potato, and very regularly you're wiping mashed potato off the table that you're about to display your work. Usually I'm talking to an audience who doesn't want to be there, or hasn't chosen to be there at least. They often don't know who I am, and oftentimes they would be much prefer to be outside, perhaps hopping on one leg. And sometimes I feel exactly the same. My audience can be potato-like in their reception. Sometimes I can find myself answering questions which seem to have no bearing on the carefully constructed talk that I've just given. Perhaps a question like, when can I eat my sandwiches? Or can you tie my shoelaces? I'm quite sure Margaret Atwood never has to answer these kind of questions. When can I eat my sandwiches and can you tie my shoelaces? And yet, for all this, I think I'm lucky with my audience because these exchanges with children break through any nonsense of my being more important than them. We are equal. We're discussing the vital things, shoelaces, sandwiches, fluffy pencil cases, a dead pet, a lost cardigan, a dad sleeping downstairs on the couch, a playground fall, a joy, a sorrow, a worry. And then there are those things that children say that stay with me. Most recently, I was giving a talk at a primary school in Preston. It was about my latest book, Smile. The story is told in the voice of an 11-year-old called Clarice Bean. And it's about ideas big and small. It's, you know, it's funny and touching in part and sometimes sad, but it's a book which ultimately presents hope. I think hope in children's literature is very important. I don't particularly subscribe to rules for children's writing, set rules, but perhaps if there's one that I abide by, it's hope. It's set in an ordinary sort of family, and it's about the ordinary of the everyday, just the things that happen, but also the extraordinary in the everyday, that how bad luck can turn to good luck, how things turn very quickly, about the funny things and the difficult, and the things that happen to us all the time. We're in the environment of home, you know, there are many things that we have in common. And as the mundane is unfolding, so too, there can be bigger things. And for Clarice, there she is sensing the crackle of anxiety for her mother. And it's a growing anxiety about her father's health. And this is all going on in the family. And it's something that infiltrates her life. And yet she still has to deal with all the other things, all the things to do with school and the wider community and her friends, and the struggles, you know, with brothers and sisters and things. Meanwhile, Clarice has also been asked to take part in a project looking at endangered animals, something she's very keen to do and children are often asked to do. But actually there's a heaviness to this because we are looking at a creature going extinct. And at the same time, she's also worrying about her father. And the two things are sort of parallel in a way because she can no more help the whale shark that she's picked as her subject for her endangered species than she can her father. What can she do for him? And she picks this whale shark thinking, you know, it seems like a ferocious animal because it's the biggest fish in the ocean and they grow to 18 meters long sometimes. They have 3,000 teeth. And they are sharks, they're not whales. But yet they are vulnerable. This huge thing is so vulnerable and it is dependent on the zooplankton. And yet the zooplankton cannot survive if the oceans get too warm, and the whale shark may not survive without the zooplankton. And if there are too many zooplankton, there may not be enough phytoplankton because the zooplankton eat them. And if there aren't enough phytoplankton, then maybe there's not enough oxygen. And it's this round and round, this game of consequences that we're looking at in the story. And there's a big subject, the importance of everything, the equality of everything, that one thing lives for another, and the importance of the small. And I talk also about the power of the small. I mean, I show them my knitwear that has been decimated by the tiniest creatures in my wardrobe, and these holes just held together with tiny bits of wool now. And that shows you the power of it. But there's also the power and the smallness of us and how we can feel so insignificant, but in the whole scheme of things, we are also very important. And so anyway, I give the talk and we discuss these things, and then a little queue is formed and the children come up to have their book signed or a little piece of paper written on. And some of them will ask me a question and others will duck their head and try not to make any eye contact. but there's usually a little flutter of children that gather around the signing table, and then questions are asked, and then this begins to turn into a more abstract sort of chatting, and the chatting becomes quite elastic, and that's what I really love about it. There is no small talk. We are talking about the things we want to talk about. And there was one little boy who had sort of merged me with my 11-year-old protagonist, and he said to me, "So Lauren, are you 11? And I said, "I wish, but I wrote my first book in 1999, so I can't be." And he said, "Oh, so you were 25. And I mean, apart from his arithmetic being very, very quick, it was one of those moments that I think about afterwards and hurry to scribble down quickly, because, you know, it's so brilliant. He sort of got it. And yes, of course, I am 11 and I am 25, and I wrote the book from the point of view of an 11-year-old. And so I was drawing on my 11-year-old self. I don't go into some kind of weird childlike trance, like some people have asked me that. Do you live in a childlike state? No, but I am drawing on that part of me that remembers it and feels it. And I'm also 25, because he didn't know this, but I actually conceived the character in my mind when I was probably around 25. And so it all made sense to me. And in any case, don't we slip between ages? I don't know if everyone feels like this, but a number of people I've spoken to say yes. I mean, as we, in different situations, or depending on the way someone's speaking to us, we are 11, 25, 81, 62. We're all of those things. And yet he was saying something more powerful than that somehow, because what he was doing was properly connecting with me in that moment. Because what did it matter what age he was and what age I was? He wouldn't have minded what I'd said back to him. And I felt no age at all, which is my most happy state, actually. I always feel best when I'm unaware of it anymore. And it was very moving, not only what he was saying and that connection made, but it took me right back to my child self, which we all have inside us, because we all grow with our child self, whether remembered or not. Those experiences are in the bones of us, and there's something very reassuring about it. And his curiosity is reassuring, because curiosity is so very important, and it gets sort of drummed out of us. And Smile, the book, came out of my fears of climate change, and I needed to reconnect with any sense of hope and joy. And I did that by remembering things from childhood, but actually looking at them through a child's point of view. And that curiosity and interest and excitement, along with worry, of course, along with worry and anxiety, but how they look at things differently. And if only we would nurture that curiosity and allow it, because of course it's there to problem solve, it's there to create, and it's there to understand. It really helps us understand other people and step into other people's shoes. But I think more than that, it does inspire passion, and that is a precious thing, because passionate people find a way. Thank you.
Lauren, thank you so much. That was such a beautiful note to end on, and another very hopeful note as well, giving us a new meaning, connecting us with our childhood selves. Thank you to all of our brilliant speakers tonight, to Johann, to Clover, to Orlando, Dorian and Lauren. Remember that you can order copies of their books directly from the wonderful Newham Bookshop, our independent book selling partner. Do check out the chat for more information about how to do that. Keep your eyes peeled for more 5x15 events by checking out our website. We hope you'll join us for a special event with the amazing ecologist Robin Wall Kimmerer. That's in person at the Conway Hall on Thursday, the 30th of May. And on June 17th, we have Hugh Fearnley Whittingstall joining us online to talk about how we can eat more plants. You don't want to miss those. Thanks again all, and good evening.